I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is oral storytelling in its purest form. One story written by one guy and recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD is serialized, but please feel free to start with this very episode. Afterward, once you're hooked, you can dive into the podcast's impressive back catalog or pick up one of the prose ebooks available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 70. The centaurs' hooves pounded upon the plains. They kicked up dirt, dust, and tufts of grass, churning the earth, preparing it for the wildness that would, no doubt, soon return to it, would soon reclaim its place in the natural order, now that the aberration, that heaving city-state, now that it had been scoured remorselessly from those once majestic steps. The centaur horde flowed over the plains like an unstoppable tidal wave of taut, glistening muscle. Countless tribes brought together in pursuit of a single goal: the fall, utter and complete, of Ravenna. Stamp, that stern-faced chief, covered in scars, mementos of previous battles, badges of honor that he wore proudly. He galloped at the head of his tribe, setting an impossible pace, but one that his followers were desperate to keep up with. They chased behind him, chanting and singing, drawing strength from the growing wilderness around them, from the plants that had begun to break through the old cobblestones of Ravenna, from the small creatures of the field that had taken up residence in the wreckage of that corrupt city. And as they did so, Stamp looked to his side, looked down proudly upon his son, who, despite his young age, despite being half the size of his father, still managed to keep up with their war party. They had been up late the night before. Stamp had attended the war council, along with all the other chiefs, and they had voted unanimously to sweep down upon Ravenna in full force. And why wouldn't they? Every time they smashed into the city's walls, built over decades of expansion, they cracked, quaked, and crumbled, and, given enough time, the cowards, the craven degenerates that they contained, they simply retreated into the filth and degradation that was the hallmark of not just Ravenna, but all cities. So, clutching their bows, with full quivers of simply made but devastatingly effective arrows strapped to their backs, they charged toward those sad, slouching walls, rushed toward where they sagged upon the horizon. They would smash against the walls. They would send them toppling over upon the civilized men that defended them, and they would flood into yet another section of Ravenna. They would clear the way for nature, for the wilds to once again retake what belonged to them, and they would continue to assault that convulsing, festering blight upon creation, to beat it back behind its original borders. And perhaps even beyond. Perhaps it might be as the shamans had predicted, as they had foretold. Perhaps he, Stamp, would be the one to lead his people to the very heart of Ravana, to trample the corrupt fruits of civilization, to grind them into the dirt where they could nourish the returning wilderness. He allowed a knowing smile to take up residence upon his stern, weathered visage. Perhaps he would. Perhaps. But he was suddenly pulled out of his reverie by a high-pitched, frustrated voice coming from his right. "It's time I was given a name." His son spoke plainly and forcefully, with a restraint that, while in need of tempering, of strengthening, was far beyond the scant number of years that he had spent alive within that border realm. Stamp began to pick up his speed. "If you have breath for idle chatter, we must not be moving fast enough." But his son would not be deterred. And Stamp was shocked, impressed, and proud that he was able to keep up with his tribe's adult warriors, even while speaking. "And if I can run with the chief, then I should have a name." Stamp looked down and grinned at his son. "You already have a name, and a proud one at that. You are Stampson." The boy's anger began to flare. "You know what I mean. I deserve a real name. I deserve my own name." Stamp reached out and patted his son on the back, his low back, the equine part of his body. "All in due time. A name is one of the most important things a man ever possesses. The only thing that can never be taken from him. So it's important you earn yours." He smiled once again, disarming his son. After all, war was no place for anger. "And besides, if you don't earn your name yourself, how would we know what to call you?" Stampson remained unconvinced, but Stamp was unconcerned. He remembered being his son's age, remembered the all-consuming angst and frustration, the utter certainty, the wholehearted belief that the entire world was out to get you. He grinned. As he had grown older, he had learned the truth, as adults often do. The entire world is out to get you. But there's no reason to be upset about it. Because the world, it's out to get everyone. He made a mental note to explore that thought later, to compose a song, something to sing around the campfire at night. After they had completed their day's campaign, after they had beaten Ravana yet further back, after they had, hopefully, toppled the walls that now loomed ahead of them, as they charged ahead, unchallenged. Without a single command, without even a word, because none was necessary, Stamp's men, his soldiers, They took out their bows. They tested their strings, and they prepared their arrows. Their hands worked diligently, carefully, with a calmness that seemed out of place with the frantic pace kept by their pounding hooves, by the lathered, rippling muscles of their more equine parts. And before they had even drawn within range of the humans' weak, ineffectual bows, the centaurs pulled back their weapons, the ones crafted of mighty, ancient oak, and they let fly volley after volley of arrows, a cloud of stinging death that arced up into the air, that threatened to pierce the very suns of that border realm before turning and plummeting back down toward the terrified humans that mounted those doomed walls. And as the arrows found their mark, as they began to fall not just upon the wall's ramparts, but beyond them, down upon the pastures and fields they protected, Stamp led his men onward. He began to howl out a song of his ancestors, one they had discovered, not written or even heard somewhere, but one that they had found etched into their very blood. He howled it out in a deep, sonorous voice, and his heart was warmed as he heard, no, as he felt his son's lighter, higher voice harmonizing with his own. And as they sang, as they charged, as they let their arrows fly, Stamp's entire being swelled with excitement and anticipation. Excitement for a chance to relive the moment that had earned him his name. Anticipation for the stampede. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 drums being beaten all at once, wailed upon repeatedly, not by weak-willed, weaker-fleshed humans, but by 1,000 horses, by 4 times 1,000 thunderous hooves crashing time and time again against the earth, that ground that shuddered and spasmed in response. The noise stirred something inside of Stamp, and he could see it stirred in his son as well. He could feel himself tap into something ancient, something primal, something necessary and righteous. It spurred him on to greater and greater speeds, speeds that before would have been unattainable, but that now, in the moment, caught up in the frenzy of the stampede, speeds that he and his son were happy to not only meet, but to exceed as they led the stampede together. In unison, and again, without a single word spoken, Stamp, his son, and the rest of the centaurs changed the grips on their massive longbows. They took them up in 2 hands, wielding them as the oaken quarterstaffs they now required, and together, with hoof, with fist, and with staff, the centaur horde smashed against Ravenna's crumbling walls. The people of Ravenna were prepared, more prepared than the centaurs had expected. And they rained rocks, sticks, hot oil, and worse down upon their attackers. But the people of Ravenna had prepared for what they knew, prepared for what they knew how to handle. They had prepared for human invaders, and thus had only prepared to hurl death down upon the areas surrounding the wall's gates. but the herd that swarmed their walls, the menace that threatened to wash them from the earth like a vengeful tidal wave. They were not human. They were centaur, and they were a horde, a pulsing mass of horse and man, heaving forward in riotous convulsions, a horde that did not exhibit a preference for where along the wall it attacked, that would just as soon smash against the walls themselves as Ravenna's iron-banded, heavily barred gates. So while the centaurs closest to the door were slaughtered, were beaten and driven back by Ravenna's hopeless defenders, those that attacked the walls themselves had no such problems. And among them was Stamp, his son, and the tribe that would follow their family into the bowels of hell itself. And with only token resistance, only an occasional arrow that could easily be deflected by the centaur's thick, heavy hide, they smashed into the walls. With staffs and with hooves, they smashed into the walls, and as they did so, the entire length of that crumbling stone edifice shuddered, its stones cracking, its mortar weakening. They struck it again and again, keeping rhythm with the ancient chorus sung again and again by Stamp, whose heart swelled with joy at seeing his son stampede next to him. They fought with an unspeakable passion, a passion that burned so white-hot that it threatened to scald every member of the centaur horde. They fought with desire, not with a base human desire, but with a higher, more noble need. They fought not for themselves, but for the very wilds of that border realm. They fought to take back what had once belonged to nature, what had been created and nourished by the primal forces of creation, to reclaim what was once wild and would be once again. Their passion was palpable, their desire undeniable. And as they smashed against the wall again and again, as they struck it with their wooden staffs, as they pushed against it with hands and shoulders, it was their feet, their hooves, that did the real work. As Stamp continued his song, as he continued to chant that ancient ballad, the one with words so old he could not interpret them, though he knew exactly what they meant, as he sang that rousing hymn, his hooves and those of his warriors kept time. Their hooves smashed down to the earth again and again, as what began as a senseless, rumbling cacophony turned into a rolling crescendo, one that began at the back of the centaur horde and rippled through its frenzied masses until it made its way to the front, to where Stamp still sang proudly before Ravenna's trembling walls. Stamp continued to sing, and as he did, as the crescendo peaked again and again, as the ground itself began to rumble in time with the song, the centaur's hooves spoke with the wild places, spoke with the eternal presence they served, spoke with the earth itself. And within that pounding rhythm, within it lay a promise that they, the centaurs, would always serve that presence, that they would always defend the wild places, that they would do what must be done, what had been ordained, if the earth would give them this one favor. And so, as Stamp's song, as the horde's pounding accompaniment, as the frenzied attack upon the walls reached a fever pitch. That eternal presence obliged its servants. It shattered the bedrock beneath their feet. It crumbled the foundation of that mighty wall, the one that had been built to withstand Armageddon itself. The eternal presence delivered on its part of the bargain. And the walls fell. The walls crumbled. They broke and they fell in a dozen places, and then in a dozen more, and a dozen more, until the walls of stone were gone, and the only wall that remained was the wall of flesh, of man and of horse, that which moved in mass in to Ravenna. They overran that arrondissement, that section of the city that mere decades ago had been considered central Ravenna, that had seemed impossibly removed from the wildness of the centaurs, their numerous warring tribes, and the horde that they had fashioned themselves into. But now, that was no longer the case. Now, the centaur horde was everywhere, shattering cobblestones beneath their hooved feet, toppling buildings with the aftershocks of their seismic attack, routing the arrondissement's meager defenses, and striking down those who chose to stand their ground, those too brave or too stupid to simply run. The centaurs broke formation, because the hard part was done. This was the fun part. This was the triumphant part, the spiritual part. This, what came next, was no longer battle. It was worship. It was a divine ritual. It was the deliverance of yet another parcel of earth, a return to the natural order, to the way things should be. And the only thing that stood in their way? Ragtag groups of terrified humans. The centaurs, they did not relish the hunts they went on to feed their families. They found it grim, and they found it soul-searing to slaughter another creature, to bring a simple life to an end, just so that they could continue theirs. They didn't enjoy it. They didn't celebrate it. But they did it because it was necessary. Likewise, it was not with joy that the centaurs turned their gaze to the humans. It was not with glee that they restrung their bows, that they charged in close, that they trampled the men, women, and children before them. But they did it because it was necessary. Stamp hung back, observing the horde, observing his men. He had been blooded time and time again. He had earned his name, had earned his place within the wilds. He had nothing to prove. So he allowed the other centaurs to rush forward, to rush past him as he lent casual aid to his men through the flight of an occasional arrow. But as he watched, he paid special attention to one particular centaur, to his son. He watched with pride as Stampson charged down a hulking brute of a human, one cloaked in those jet black fabrics, wielding a wicked-looking baton. Those centaurs were far larger than humans. Stampson was still young, and this corpulent, dense-looking specimen towered over him. But though the human let loose a mighty haymaker swing, though he could have caved in Stampson's skull if his blow had connected, he was far, far, far too slow. Because after ducking slightly to dodge the human's clumsy blow, Stampson did exactly as he had been taught. He used everything available to him. He reared back upon his hind legs. He struck out with his fore, with his mighty, rock-hard hooves, and he connected with both of them, sending the human sprawling out upon the ground. But as Stampson closed the distance, as he raised his bow up, clutching it with both hands, a look of grim acceptance upon his face, ready to finish it, ready to do what was necessary. He hesitated. He stopped. He stalled. He paused, because when he looked down at the human, he didn't see a villainous defiler of the land. He didn't see a pillaging destroyer. He didn't see a plague set loose upon a world that was made perfect, kept pristine in a time long past. No. What he saw was a crying, pitiful, terrified boy. The human begged him. Stampson couldn't understand the words. They were forbidden from learning the human's foul, gutter language. But he didn't need to understand them. He could tell from the body language, from the way he cowered, from his outstretched hands, from the tears streaming down his face. This man, this boy, posed no threat to Stampson or anyone else. If he had a choice, he wouldn't have even been there. He would have been anywhere else. Who was Stampson to end his life, to take his life? Why should he? But as Stampson stood contemplating what he would do next, stood observing the sad, despicable creature, he was startled out of his reverie by the long, thick, colorfully fletched arrow that seemed to sprout out of the human's left eye before his blubbering stopped, and he crumpled to the ground. Stampson, what were you thinking? The boy's father galloped up, furious. Hesitation, stalling, disinterest. This is not how a centaur earns his name. The boy looked at his father, confused. But I thought... Stampson shook his head, setting his long braids swinging from side to side. He was just a boy. Stamp softened for a moment, but then remembered himself, remembered what was necessary, what had to happen. He took his son's shoulders in his arm, forcing him to gaze upon his father's grim, scarred visage. No, he was not just. He was a human, and he, like all humans, only understood one language, that of force. Stampson screwed up his face, listening to the screams and the sounds of wood on bone as the battle moved past them, deeper to that arrondissement. The father saw how conflicted his son was, so he released him, and he began to gallop ahead, motioning his son to follow him. You don't know what it was like. What it was like before. The two charged through the city. Stamp's breakneck pace necessitated that Stampson do nothing but struggle to keep up. But he was relieved to have a break, a respite, no matter how brief, from the savagery of combat. But though Stampson had to pant to keep up, his father, his muscular legs and his massive barrel chest, was more than capable of speaking while he ran. You're too young to remember. I myself am barely old enough. He frowned and he shook his head, setting his own heavily feathered braid, laced with gray, swinging. You don't know what it was like. What it was like when our people, our tribes, our families, when we were pushed out, when the ceaseless, senseless expansion of Ravenna threatened to wipe us out, and when it almost did. The two charged through the crumbling ruins of that outer arrondissement, nimbly dodging falling stones and frantic humans, lunging out from dark alleyways in a last-ditch effort to defend their doomed city. Worst of all, you don't know what it was like before Ravenna became a cancer upon this world, before Ravenna began to defile and devour all it touched. You don't know who we were. You don't know who we truly are. You can't. And you likely never will. Stamp turned his head away, fighting back the tears. And for that, I am truly sorry. Stampson was confused. But when he tried to speak, his voice wouldn't come. He was too out of breath. So all he could do was continue running after his father, continue galloping into the arrondissement's central square. The buildings of the area had caught fire, and they put off a thick, acrid smoke as they burned and melted away the decadence of civilization. The humans and the centaurs, we both use fire. Perhaps too much. It's true. Stamp led his son to the center of the square, to an area littered with debris. And as the centaur chief spoke, he began to pick through the charred sticks and timber. While we use fire to clear the way for the future, for a better future. The centaur chief found what he searched for. So he stopped. He frowned, a face of utter misery and despondence, an expression of sorrow at what he was about to do, at what was necessary for him to do. The humans, they use the fire to consume their future. Before Stampson could respond, before he could do anything but look on in shocked terror, his father shot his front legs out, smashing open a large, tightly woven bundle of sticks turned black from flame. And what the boy saw inside, what he saw within that gruesome bundle, made his young stomach turn inside out, made his knees buckle, forced him to retch up everything he had eaten that day, and then some. And Stamp, his father, he felt little better. Stamson was ill. Heavy tears streamed down his face, turned green from horror and disgust. Why? He stammered, so confused he didn't even know what question to ask. Why would they? How could they? Stamp knelt down by his son. He took his sobbing form in his arms, a cold comfort before the still smoking horror that he had uncovered. My sweet, sweet son, listen to me. He took Stamson's head in his hands, staring directly into those wet, red eyes. We fight, and it is never pretty or kind or beautiful, because fighting, it never is. But we fight because it is necessary. We fight for our children, for their future, for your future. Stamson tried to look back at the grisly truth his father had laid bare. But Stamp wouldn't allow it. He forced his son to look him directly in the eye as he spoke. We fight against the humans and their savage short-sightedness, their cruel myopia. We fight against the humans who, in their greed and their narcissism, as an expression of their self-centered death wish, seek only to protect their own future. And then, reluctantly, Stamp allowed his son to look back, to gaze upon the truth, to look with clear eyes, with full knowledge of the bestial nature of the world in which he had been born. And as he did so, he spoke through a flood of tears. And in pursuit of that death wish, they sacrifice their children. Thanks for checking out this, the finest episode of SKALD to date. SKALD's fanbase is growing steadily and consistently, for which I am extremely grateful. But still, it's not enough. The trouble is, with so many podcasts out there, with SKALD being such a unique thing, with no advertising budget to spend on getting the word out, I rely on you, SKALD fans, to help spread the good word of the only story that matters. So please, go to iTunes, go to Google Play, to Stitcher, to Amazon, and please write reviews for the podcasts. Write one on each platform. Write a review for one of the prose volumes. Write a review for all of the prose volumes. These are the only way for independently created and produced shows and books to find their audience. Reviews are crucial to the show's growth, but in order for me to keep the show going, I need something else. Filthy lucre. In the old days, a SKALD would need a single wealthy benefactor to basically sponsor him so that he could continue pursuing his art. Fortunately for us, we live in the future, where each of you, for just a couple bucks a month, can chip in to help keep SKALD going strong. Go to patreon.com/SKALD and sign up today. If you dig SKALD, please Tell everyone you know, especially on social media. And if you're tweeting about it or posting on Facebook, why not tag me in it? That way, I can be totally shameless and retweet and share all positive comments about my work. It's the future. This is what we do. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on all social media. Or head to aubreySitterson.com for links to everything. This week's plug goes to something that might seem a little off-brand for the show, but bear with me. It's Enon's face, body, and beauty products. It's actually my amazing wife's company, and they specialize in natural, cruelty-free, plant-based beauty products for men and women. Lotions, face cleansers, face masks, bath soaks, beard oils, shaving gel, face toners, and more. Great for you and great for gifts. Go to enons.com. That's spelled AENONS.com. AENONS.com. Check it out today. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.